Hello, beautiful community. You're very welcome to this chat about the potentially escalating drone attacks on Russian territory, how to think about them, right, as they come to constitute as kind of a minor but nevertheless a second front, and what to expect in terms of the politicization of that depoliticized blob in the middle in Russia if these attacks continue and escalate. So let's just put a little bit of context here. First of all, what's the big story? I think the big story, as a kind of a canvas against which I'd cast the drone attacks on Russian territory, is the story of Ukraine potentially needing to face the reality of a long war. A long war might not happen. In the possibility that something dramatic changes in the next 6 months is not entirely unavailable. But the West is supporting Ukraine to the level of independence plus, as I call it, not to the level of a victory, which doesn't mean Ukraine can't get a victory, but it certainly means that that victory would be an achievement well in excess of what Ukraine has been prepped for. And maybe that kind of achievement would have to be dependent on some kind of unexpected and catastrophic Russian collapse. Now, second, the preponderance of military expert opinion is, again, relatively cautious about Ukraine's capacity for dramatic success with the counteroffensive. And the less remarkable the results of the counteroffensive are, the more compelling that lever of taking the war onto the Russian soil, Russian territory will be for Ukraine. We've talked about this before. So I think there is a kind of a connection there. And I think that war on Russian soil makes much more sense in the context of Ukraine, makes much more sense as an eventuality in the context of Ukraine potentially needing to readjust to a longer war. The ethics of this we've already discussed. I recommend you to think about this beyond justice and injustice, right? Ukraine taking the war onto Russian territory is a kind of necessity. It is a byproduct of an existential war for national survival. Now, what are the politicizing capabilities of these actions? Now, we know that the majority of the Russian population is in a radically depoliticized state. And we know that that depoliticization is not disinterest in politics, it is positive resistance to politics. We know that it is not disinterest in being informed, it is positive resistance to being informed beyond a certain point, having already been informed enough to know that you really don't want to get any more informed than you are, because that would put one in a quite impossible position of having to admit two things: that one's arrangement with politics, or at least the arrangement one's ended up in with politics, has become so catastrophic and tragic that, I mean, it's just absolutely unimaginable, right? That your arrangement with politics is so bad that what you thought was relatively benign is causing regional havoc, global havoc, and death and destruction, and spiraling your country into a kind of oblivion, if not disintegration. And so that's the first thing you have to face, that your arrangement with politics has ended in disaster. And the second thing you have to face is that in your depoliticized state, you don't see any solutions to this, right? So there is this, as Greg Uden likes to say, catastrophic failure of capacity for normative thought. Russians cannot imagine an alternative Russia. The degree to which they can't do that is utterly extraordinary. They can't. And if one could imagine it, and if one could be helped into it, one were a Russian, what one would want next is an account of agency, of how one begins to move toward the realization of that goal. Who should do how and what and when and what, blah, 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 by what means and so on. All of that is missing. And so hence there is evasion. Now, so far the nature of the attacks is important to specify. It's minor. It's qualitatively different to seeing even just a few kinjals a month above your head. It's totally different. So what you've got now is not likely to dramatically create one or another kind of politicization if it sustains for a long period of time. I think the level of droning of Moscow at the moment can be normalized, even if it lasted years. This changes if the scale is different and if there are numbers of civilian casualties, right? This would be more likely to create depoliticized action, Russians running away from Moscow, and maybe some politicization. But you would need a lot of damage and destruction for some politicization that's significant to occur. Whether one's talking about radicalization of people who are already favorably disposed to the war, whether one's talking about people becoming favorably disposed who are depoliticized, or whether people who are depoliticized just being thrown into some kind of greater confrontation with the political reality they face. Now, let's do a kind of a recreation of how the depoliticized blob might feel about it. But before that, let me make one more sort of pub level prediction. So just like we have this sort of pub level prediction about a longer war and a limitedly successful counteroffensive leading to Ukraine escalating more on Russian territory. Right? So another prediction is that a pub level prediction here. I'm not saying this in my capacity as a political philosopher. Is that it sure as hell makes sense to expect a much bigger attack on Moscow in the weeks and months to come. Surely. So that's a completely reasonable expectation to have. We might even get more attacks on the Kremlin. That's something else I want to put on the table. It seems to me that whatever we've seen on Russian soil, I think if I put it now at that level of generality, it becomes less of a pub and becomes more of an adequate prediction. Whatever we have seen, right, it is bound to escalate, capacity allowing on the Ukrainian side. So let's do a little recreation for the depoliticized blob at this level of sort of drone encounters. Let's say it's Moscow, and let's say that I'm a Russian, which I'm not really, and let's say I'm a depoliticized Russian. Ricky? My neighbor Ricky? Did you see the drone earlier? Yeah. Yeah, it's weird. Yeah, I think it's the third one I've seen so far. Unbelievable what kind of stuff is going on out of our windows, right? Okay, I'll speak to you later, Ricky. Bye. Hi, Susanna. So, I suppose the names should be Russian. Hi, Susanna. It's absolute horror what's going on, isn't it? There's like stuff in our sky. What do they think they're doing, these politicians? I think they're losing the plot completely. I mean, I think they're out of control. I have no idea what is going on. I mean, maybe they know what they're doing, but I mean, it just doesn't look good. I think they just can't sort it out. I mean, maybe it's because they've got themselves into this, whatever they've got themselves into in Ukraine. Maybe that's what's going on. They're out of their depth there. Um, I mean, ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So you see, um, it, this reflection is cyclical, and it never fully breaks out into this is a direct product of something deeply unacceptable that my regime is doing, that is a gross violation of not just our neighbors but of us too. These people are, that these drones are metaphors of devastation in Ukraine, and our country, the culprit, spiraling into a sort of a future without a future. So this cyclicality, and you can hear it when you engage with Russians. See what's going on in the sky, and what you shouldn't underestimate is, of course, is fear, and a sort of a real instinct to get through this story with their back to it, avoiding a confrontation with the regime by any means possible. And that means sort of often, as Kirill Rogov likes to say, picking, wonderful Russian expert, picking one's own salad. Well, this is actually me saying it. Kirill Rogov says that what you pick the least the least unpalatable narrative the government spins about this and kind of go with it. Or you could say, as I was just about, you pick a kind of a self-selected salad about what's going on out of government narratives, that you feel like you're not in confrontation with the regime. So yeah, it's completely cyclical. It's the horror in the sky, and if it's got a political cause, it's because the politicians are crazy. Maybe they're crazy everywhere. Maybe ours are much crazier, but like, what are we going to do about that? So that's where we are for now. But the global picture is that this is part of a longer war, and this is an absolutely essential lever for Ukraine that Ukraine will be pulling to the maximum of its capacity if the war grinds into a long-distance conflict of the kind that Ukraine is desperate to avoid, but looks like it won't be able to on the current evidence. Lots of love.